Working from home or remotely is likely to be the way we do business moving forward. In this new frontier, there will be all types of physical and digital products designed and created to support this new working culture. For this episode, we pick up where the previous episode left off, and I chat with Sam Hariton about the tech behind a virtual team he leads, how he and his team decided upon the products it currently uses, and what the future of remote work and virtual collaboration could be. I'm Jarrett Carpenter, and this is Wi-Fi Water. Sam, good evening. Welcome to Wi-Fi Water. How are you?
Doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for hopping on. This episode is going to be the bookend to our previous episode where I was able to speak with Mike Lasky about office culture in a virtual environment and kind of the modus operandi and the best way to be a team lead in that environment to create a productive environment, an environment where people want to come to work, an environment where people want to log on and they're excited to work with their other team members, even if they've never met them and they live 3,000 miles away and a bunch of different time zones away. And so I'm talking with Sam tonight, and we're going to talk about all of the different tools, kind of the more behind the scenes of how that all happens. Because in order to have a productive office virtual environment, you have to use a certain amount of programs, probably fit together, I guess you could say like a puzzle, Sam, to be able to then create the most efficient team. And so with that said, what is the single most important piece of software or SaaS or whatever you want to say that Widelity uses or that you think Widelity could just absolutely not work without?
So I think the most critical part in terms of this project where we have an entirely remote team is the video conferencing. And so that was something that we determined very early on. We wanted to have a really good, reliable tool for that. And thinking back in early 2017, we were looking at it. We knew we were going to need to coordinate remotely. At the time, there was just a few of us, and it was going to be important to be able to have creative, productive conversations together. And at the time, everything we were doing was using the Google Suite because we got that from our attachment to Widelity Corporate. So that had Google Hangouts. So Google Hangouts gives you both a chat, and it also gives you a way to do video calls. But it was difficult once you either got a significant number of people on, or you wanted to screen share, or you wanted to have somebody join who was not part of a Google Suite somewhere already. If you didn't have experience with Gmail or Google Hangouts, it took some effort to explain to somebody how to answer a Google Hangout call. And so we really wanted another tool. And one of the first ones we stumbled across was Zoom. And again, this is back in 2017 where Zoom was this kind of like upstart video conferencing only, but very few people had heard of it. And so we quickly figured out that one of the things Zoom did really well is it had slightly better video encoding. The picture seemed to be a little bit clearer in our non-empirical testing, and it gives you that real face-to-face connection.
In your non-empirical testing, I like that. You didn't have a control
Brian,
group, and
Brian looked clearer on Zoom than he looked on Google Hangouts, and all right, that's a point for Zoom.
Very scientific.
Absolutely. The screen sharing definitely had more tools connected to it. You could screen share a specific window. People who were receiving your share could annotate the page and add things to it. These are features that at the time Google Hangouts didn't support well, if it supported them at all. And then the big feature at the time was you could send somebody a Zoom link. They would click the link, it would open the page in their browser. Zoom would auto install itself and pop open the window without any action from the user. Now, this doesn't work anymore because somebody rightfully pointed out the security aspects of that. But when you need to get people outside of Widelity who are not always tech savvy, and it was really easy. You send them a link and it would guide them through and do the whole process for them. And so that was made it a lot easier to get people to join calls with us when we needed them to.
I've only known Zoom for maybe a little bit more than a year. So pre-pandemic, not an early adopter like you. And I will say it's a far superior videoing for professional than even Skype. And Skype is something that I had been using for a long time. And I still use, depending upon who I'm talking with, if we met on Skype years ago, because I've been using Skype since about '08 when I studied abroad during college in Argentina. And I was always really impressed with Skype, but Zoom's video quality, like you're saying, is even better. And this is something that Mike and I spoke about. And I didn't think about it until Mike brought it up, but the importance of that quality, and you're talking about your non-empirical evidence test, that if you can't be in the same room with someone, you have to try to recreate that as much as you can. And if you have a fuzzy pixelation, it's like playing James Bond on 64 when it first came out. I didn't think about how important video was to the virtual workspace until I think these two conversations. Mike really brought that up as a very important and prominent part of the structure and what makes the flow happen. And now you're bringing that up as well. Do you think Google has any incentive to get people? Are they trying to get market share from Zoom? Zoom is obviously a paid subscription thing. Does Google Hangouts have a thing where if you want more than so-and-so over a certain amount of time, you have to do that? Or because they're already part of the Google suite, it doesn't matter? Do you know?
I got to be clear about what is true now and what was true to the best of our knowledge then. Google Hangouts was the only video option through the Google suite. They have since rolled out Google Meet, which is definitely a more professional, more business-oriented program, and it works a lot closer and fills a lot more of the functionality that Zoom does. And had that been an option when we were first kind of starting this team, we may have considered that more deeply and compared them in a little bit more depth. There's advantages to Google Meet over Zoom in terms of ease of use now versus before, because I think if I remember right, Google Meet is entirely web-based, so you don't have to worry about installing anything. But in terms of Google's incentives, it's hard to tell sometimes how much Google's priorities are arcane and inscrutable sometimes.
What do you mean?
And well, my understanding of Google's business model is they make most of their money through their advertising. And so Gmail, the Google Suite, these are not primary integral components to Google. They aren't something that Google is focusing a lot of its existence on. Whereas Zoom, video conferencing is Zoom. That is the thing they do. That is where they spend all their R&D on. Whereas Google feels some of the functionality of things in Google feel like they're an afterthought or they're some engineer's pet project. And so there's no guarantee that Google is going to perpetually maintain something if you adopt it. Google Suite is sufficiently well enough adopted, it's not likely to disappear, but there's parts of the innards that change without warning. And granted, there's Zoom changes without warning too.
So thinking about Zoom, is there anything that you would like to see them improve upon or even add that they currently don't have that would further the efficiency of the virtual office?
I don't think there's very much that Zoom doesn't have that somebody else does. I think there's some functional issues with video conferencing, especially when you have large numbers of people in a meeting. So our conversation here, one-on-one, if the audio and the communication is not an issue. By the nature of video conferencing, you can only have one person talking at any given time because everybody hears the person talking equally loud. If you got a bunch of people into an actual physical room, if somebody was saying something at one end of the room and it wasn't interesting to people at the other end of the room, they could start a side conversation. And you can't do that. You can't do that in Zoom. And I'm not aware of any tool that will let you organically create those side conversations that kind of split the group. In a business environment, this isn't an issue, but in a social environment, it creates limitations.
You can kind of do that in the private direct messaging if you're in a group chat. But if that's turned off, obviously not verbal though.
Right. And you have to have the side conversation through text messaging, whereas in a physical room, you can just turn your head and talk at a different volume, and it's instantaneous. And in a physical room, you can tell by people's eyes which conversation they're paying attention to, whereas in Zoom, everybody's looking just off the camera because they're all looking at the picture on their screen, which doesn't line up with the camera. It's a lot harder to tell who's directly paying attention to the conversation, who's been distracted by a chat message, who's in the process of engaged in something completely unrelated.
I often feel like it's like Weekend at Bernie's because I really don't know if people are, when you're talking and there's 30 people on a screen and everyone looks like Weekend at Bernie's, they're just like kind of glass-eyed. Are they really listening? I don't know. There's not really an empirical way. There's a non-empirical way
Yeah.
to, I guess, come to that conclusion. So, okay, Zoom is something that is absolutely necessary to fostering a very productive, positive virtual environment. What's a
Yeah, so
software that Widelity uses that you thought they would never need?
so there were times at the very beginning in our wildest dreams, we didn't think we'd grow big enough for certain things to happen. But once we did grow, then it was obvious what things we would need because we knew certain things didn't apply until you hit a certain size. So when we first started this project in 2017, our first few clients got us something on the order of, we had 4 or 5 clients and 40 something stations. And we distinctly, there's a story a lot of people heard me tell in various forums. We were thinking to ourselves, this is great. We've got this project for a few years and there's potential for growth. We could hit 70 stations and maybe in our wildest dreams, we need to prepare a system that's ready for as many as 100 stations in case we do really well. And to anyone who is working on a project now, this is hilarious because we have something on the order of 400 stations. And that is just a completely different order of magnitude than what we originally designed for. So we had a few things we went through growing pains on as we grew, and a few things that if we had known we'd do as well as we did, we would not have picked the tool that we did. One of the early dilemmas we had was we knew, because we had a distributed team, we knew we needed a software program that would manage the workflow for us. We knew very quickly that this was not something we could solve with spreadsheets. We needed a workflow tool. And it took a while to get one chosen, get it picked out, get it set up. And from the primary criteria we had were it needed to be SaaS, it needed to be something that we didn't have to install software on everybody's computer, which is not a high bar to pass. We knew we needed a tool that was going to be able to handle thousands of records. At the time, we thought maybe as many as 7,000 or 8,000 records. We needed something that was easy to build because it needed to be something, because I was going to be the one that built it. I needed to build the entire workflow into everything. And by the way, the project has already started. So every day it takes me to get it built and set up and working and tested is a day that we're running on spreadsheets that we're then going to have to completely migrate to the new system. So we need to get something up and running as quickly as possible. And it needed to be something multiple people could log into and people could keep track of what they were responsible for and what they weren't. So we looked at a number of tools so as not to besmirch any particular brand, call them A, B, and C. A was from a well-known software SaaS company, and we had a meeting with their salespeople, and they said, "Oh, we can absolutely convert our platform to build what you need. You'll just need to hire one of our developers, and he'll have it in he'll have it ready in 3 to 6 months. And it was going to be tens of thousands of dollars to get it set up. And we're looking at, it's like, I can't wait that long. And also, I have no idea how many customers I'm going to have. I don't know if I'm going to have enough profit to warrant spending that much money on this product. We looked at option B, and option B looked pretty good, except that it definitely felt like a hodgepodge of tools all jumbled together, which if we picked and chose the right parts, they might technically be able to do what we needed, but it was going to be it wasn't clear from any of the documentation or the demo account we had that it would for certain be able to do it. And then we looked at option C, and option C was clearly designed to actually solve our problem on a small scale. It was specifically advertising itself as a workflow tool. You could tell from the way it was built on a cloud. I believe we guessed it was the Google Compute Engine. It clearly had a full database behind it, which meant that in theory, it should be able to scale to whatever size we needed. Compared to the other two, it was extremely easy to build because it actually had a GUI workflow design tool, which neither of the others had.
What do you mean GUI workflow design tool? Because that means like nothing to me.
Okay. The workflow tools we were looking at were, we were going to have this record, and this record was going to have a number of data fields in it. And as it advanced from one step to another, the system needed to keep track of what step the record was on. It needed to keep track of what step was next, and possibly it would be a different step that was next depending on what data was entered. And it needed to be able to, we had originally a flow chart that said, this person does this, then this person does this, and then if scenario 1, go to this person, if scenario 2, go to this person. And so we had this workflow of how we wanted the work to actually go. And option C was the only one that lets you build this workflow out by clicking on boxes and describing how each box connected to the next box, what had to happen at each box, what the name of each step was. It really felt like it was actually designed for somebody who was trying to build one of these workflows and wasn't a programmer developer constructing it. And in our having previously used workflow tools but never having actually built one, those are the 3 primary candidates we came across on short notice. We didn't have anyone on the team that had experience in building and running workflows. So we ended up picking option C, but we knew from the beginning, and I remember us having this conversation about it, option C was also very inexpensive. And we knew it should be capable of scaling, but it was definitely it had its ideal torque and power ranges. So if you're thinking of like a tachometer on a car, there was going to be a point where it would never actually completely redline and fail to go any faster, but it was definitely going to get less and less efficient as it scaled beyond a certain point.
So you're just describing my 2003 Honda Civic. That's what you've just done.
Yeah. And we wanted to buy the Honda Civic because the Honda Civic is A, something we could afford. B, we don't know how many suitcases we need to fit in the trunks. So why buy more than a Honda Civic? And after all, I mean, the most we're going to have is like 8 suitcases. Like, you can absolutely cram 8 suitcases in a Honda Civic if you have to.
For sure.
So here we are today. We are driving a Honda Civic with towing a U-Haul trailer full of additional suitcases.
How many suitcases? Just so we can build the mental image for everyone listening.
So what do we say? Is you could fit 8 suitcases in a Honda Civic, and we're currently sitting around 80 to 100 suitcases.
In the U-Haul.
So, in the U-Haul. Most of them are in the U-Haul. And, bless that Honda Civic, it's pulling the U-Haul, but it's definitely under load.
It's in the breakdown lane with the flashers on for sure.
Yeah, but it's going. It's definitely going. And we had to put a turbocharger in it, but that's a separate story. So
that's a Fast and the Furious reference.
Yeah.
So You have the workflow, which is the Honda Civic dragging a U-Haul with 80 suitcases when you thought you're only going to need 8 to go away on vacation or wherever you were going. You've got Zoom for the videoing, and then there's G Suite. What other components do you think you'll add in the next year to supplement those, especially that Honda Civic? Like, it's going to need oil changes more often. What things are you thinking about the workflow? Is there going to be just potential? We're going to get a new car. We're going to get the F-154 for quad cab with which can actually pull the U-Haul and put 30 of the suitcases in the trunk. If we're going to continue with that analogy, what's the future look like actually for the workflow?
This trip is going to be the last trip for the Honda Civic. It's going to make it to the end. We're going to get there. But when we're planning our next trip, we've got a much better idea of what types of cars that are out there, what types of scales they can operate effectively at. We've learned a lot about what our pain points ended up being. There were definitely parts that, so the next trip we take, the next project we proceed on, we're going to do the same thing over again, where we're going to try and scope how big is this trip, how many suitcases are we going to have to take, but we're going to have a much better idea of what happens when you get to that 9th suitcase and what does it feel like and what does it look like. And so we may, again, if the next project is to the grocery store and back, then that a Honda Civic might be plenty. But if the next trip might be to the grocery store, it might be all the way to California and back, we're going to plan a little bit and be a little bit more ready to take on the risk of a bit of a bigger tool in case things go well.
We're going to pivot a little bit here. Much of the conversation I had with Mike was about obviously the office environment. And do you think that there's any particular software tool that's out there that is currently being used to foster organic office environment interaction? And I don't even know what that would look like. I don't know whether it's like a Zoom with like games, like apples to apples. Is that something that Widelity would think about introducing as we go into the winter and we are dealing with seasonal affective disorder? We just had a stressful election. We're in a global pandemic. So it's like we're in a virtual work environment, also at a time though when there's a lot of isolation, et cetera. And I know we're both in the Northeast, and I've actually just recorded another pod talking about seasonal affective disorder and those types of things and isolation and working from home and what that feels like. And, missing the coffee pot interaction, missing the bumping into someone in the hall and asking how they are. As far as you know, is there any kind of software out there that is being used for companies to create some kind of an organic work environment?
I am not aware of something that a company is actively acquiring explicitly for the purposes of creating the organic work environment. I know that there's a number of tools out there that are meant to help promote communication in general, but they're not specifically to increase the social connectivity of the organization. For example, Slack and other chat organization tools.
Has Widelity ever used Slack, even at the earliest when you had only a handful of team members?
I do not believe that Widelity has ever used Slack unless there's been some project I'm not aware of where the client required it. Again, we're, as I'm sure Mike talked a little bit about, Widelity, there's Widelity as a whole, and then there's this particular project that we're focused on. And this project, Google Hangouts was our chat, instant message tool from the beginning. And that was largely a decision because it was already built into Gmail, which we were already using. And B, it filled all of those needs without having to have a separate tool to add on top of it.
Do you think there's a better tool out there than G Suite for email?
My personal opinion is I have yet to see an email program that is as effective for me personally than Gmail.
So we've got We have the workflow tool, which is the Honda with the U-Haul. We have G Suite, which is internal and external communication. We have Zoom, which is also internal and external communication through video. If you could build any software to help Widelity or just virtual teams to be more efficient and just be better teams, what would that be? That doesn't currently exist on the market, or would you take something from the market that you've seen that Widelity maybe uses and you would, change it a little bit? The age-old story of like the guy who created the hamburger, it was cool. It's a cool guy. But then the person who came along is like, let's put lettuce, tomato, onions, mustard. Is there lettuce, tomato, onions you want to put on a different burger, or is there just a completely different thing you want to change? And what would that be?
I haven't thought about it in those terms, so I'm going to think a little bit out loud.
That's fine.
At both of our peril.
Exactly.
So humans have a very long history of communicating and cooperating in person. And we also have a long history, but not as long, of communicating in a written form and communicating in an audio only form is even shorter. And remote video is extremely new. And if you think about the protocols and behaviors around communicating and writing to somebody, they've been around long enough that there's a style and a method of effectively communicating by written letter or email, and now instant message is kind of a newer form of communication. It's still building its details, but there's efficiencies of a lot of people trying a lot of different ways to communicate in written form, and I'm operating under the perhaps false assumption that what we're doing now is a decent, efficient system. Video conferencing is only years old, and there's nobody in the work environment today who grew up video calling other people. And so I look at my kids. My kids are used to interacting. They call grandma on the phone and they see her face. And it's weird and confusing when they call grandma and her picture's not moving. Like, where's grandma? I can hear her, but why can't I see her? And so there are limits to communicating remotely on a video call. And there are efficiencies and etiquettes and protocols and methods of that communication that's going to get developed over time. And I don't know what they're going to be, but I expect that there will be ways that it gets more efficient and more effective over time. And as long as the software keeps up with whatever those organically society developed changes are in how we communicate in a video call, then things will get better. But right now, that's past this threshold where it's now it's extremely useful to have a video face-to-face call, but it's not quite the same as in person. But it's a lot better than a phone call. You can communicate a lot more effectively, a lot more information with a lot less risk of miscommunication than a phone call.
Do you think what's missing and what I know will happen, whether it's adopted on a large scale or not, will be augmented reality, virtual reality, where when you're going to call somebody in 10 years in a business, you're going to put on the goggles and you're going to, I'm going to give a background on that. I'm not into video games. When I was growing up as a kid, my parents said, nope, you can't have consoles in the house. I was literally the only kid. And I'm still horrible at video games to this day, to the detriment of my social interaction with all those kids who are good at Fortnite. It is what it is. When I went in 2017, I went to visit a friend who worked at Facebook, and I was able to try the Oculus goggles back when it was a prototype. I think I had to sign something saying I wouldn't say anything. It was super hush hush. Like I was going to be able to look at something and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to steal that. I've got the IP in my brain. I put on these goggles and I played this game where I was like shooting, I don't know, balloons or something with a laser. I could have played that for 10 hours. Me, a guy who doesn't like video games. that is a scary thing. And that was the day that I was like, this is going to change the way the world works. Fast forward, you say this, and that's the first thing that came to my mind was like augmented reality, right? We're going to all have Oculus goggles, and that will be the things that we were literally all sitting in a boardroom, and I can turn my head and I can look at someone and then turn my head and look at someone, and they'll be able to see, I don't know. Is that something that might fulfill maybe the last 5 yards of the 100 that we've come with video calling and conferencing?
I think it absolutely could. I mean, it would have that potential to fill in some of those things you can't do on a where everybody's looking at the same flat checkerboard of other people. Gives you that complexity to it. But I mean, it also comes with its own separate form of drawbacks in that at the moment the visual clarity is not always the same. And I'm thinking in terms of like you have the VR goggles that are desperately trying to solve the screen door problem, where your eyes are so close to the screen that you can tell that there are pixels there. Even if you might not be able to pick out an individual one, your eyes can tell that it's not really actually there. And that breaks the immersion and it also produces eye strain. But that's an engineering problem that somebody will solve eventually. And I think what you've kind of hit on is you're gonna have that social development problem as well of even once we solve the virtual reality, the augmented reality, okay, now we can get people into this virtual conference room. Well, they can't stand up and walk around. You still can't, physically interact with anyone. Do we copy forward all of the work etiquette and behaviors into the virtual environment? Do we develop new ones? And I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if it will help, but I look forward to trying it if we get to that point.
It's going to be a weird place when we're at that point where we're sitting at a round table of 50 people and the person who talks, then their image is shown in the middle, kind of like a Jumbotron situation. And then when that person stops talking, just like the wait, because that is literally what Zoom does. When you're not in gallery view, the person who's talking is on the Jumbotron, and then everyone else is a brick in the wall, and so on and so forth. But as you've said, it's very interesting that your daughter, when she wants to talk with grandma has to be on the screen. Whereas when we were growing up, I think maybe that was Star Trek. It'd be like, wow, they can video conference because that was so far. We're talking pre-cell phone. We're talking pre-social media. We're talking when the internet was, I don't even know, maybe eBay. YouTube wasn't even around. We're talking arcane times, we're talking dial-up. This is where I should put in the dial-up sound to horrify all the older listeners. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, but I do believe the tools will continue to support wherever society is, at least from a business and a professional standpoint. And looking ahead, in the last episode, Mike said, hey, you know what? This is the future. We're all going to be working from home. And that's his opinion. I don't think he's wrong. I don't think you would disagree with that in any big fashion. And so it's going to be interesting to see what types of things, but that would be, we will have Nostradamus that you'll be able to go back to the pod and be like, oh, remember we talked about AR and everyone will be doing that in the board meeting. So whether but like you said, somebody will solve that software glitch by writing something different and figuring that out.
And I think what you mentioned something interesting where you've got the software development that's that's following the social development. And then occasionally you get software development that comes out with some new functionality that either had not been widespread considered and enables a whole way of working that didn't exist before. And I think to an extent, video conferencing has been one of those things where I'm sure there were people who video conferencing has been a future tech since I remember being a teenager running across the video phone, and it sort of kind of worked. But I don't think anyone, or I'm not aware of anyone predicting some of the more extended ramifications of an entire workforce entirely remote on video until more recently than that. And I feel like, especially having personally lived this transition of in an office environment to converting to entirely remote, we knew it was possible, but it's just been interesting, that transition of, we have our Friday calls and have 60 plus people all on at the same time, and the software itself only displays a finite number of them and can't actually display all 60 at the same time. And even if it did, you wouldn't be able to tell who was who. The software will keep up with the people, but the software will also, hopefully, fingers crossed, continue to enable things that allow people to dream up new, different ways of doing things. And that's how they kind of go in tandem. And I mean, if you don't need the software, if you're in a traditional office environment, you don't need the software as much. But then again, it's possible that there will be organizations that go back to, they want everybody in the office so that they can meet in person. But when you need to go visit accounting on the 3rd floor, it's just easier to Zoom them rather than ride the elevator down.
It's much easier to just click a button and say, hey, what's up?
And phones in cubicles, is there a point, if you've got access to video calling throughout your organization? Why do we need extension numbers at that point? So
for sure. Well, Sam, thank you for joining this evening, and I will see you tomorrow at work.
All right, see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Wi-Fi and Water, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Wi-Fi and Water Podcast so you can stay up to date with future episode info. And if you're listening to this on your smartphone, go ahead, leave a review, leave some stars, and definitely subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.